Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our midweek Bible study. We're going to be joined by Chad McAllister. Let's go ahead and start reading in Genesis chapter 2.
Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. Then the Lord God said, It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the cattle, and to the birds of the sky, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh at that place. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man. The man said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and were not ashamed.
Well, one of the things that's really first striking about this, and again, not something that I would have first recognized, when I became a new Christian and was going through this, but now is kind of foundational and fundamental, is the idea that God calls everything else into existence by a word, but to man he's actually speaking and interacting, and really that's a fascinating difference, and one that would have slipped by me for a number of years of my Christian life. What do you think the significance is of the fact that God is actually speaking to man instead of kind of speaking about him as he does in the other aspects of creation?
Well, I think one of the things that obviously we talked about man being distinct from the rest of creation, and this highlights one specific point, is that we were created to have a special relationship with God that the rest of creation was not, if you will, called to have. But it also kind of speaks to consciousness and will and volition and things that man attributes of man that's not part of the rest of creation.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things here is that man is created in the image of God, and there's all kinds of ideas about really what that means, and theologians have wrestled with that question since they've been wrestling with any question, really. And really, we're not here to solve all that, what that means, but clearly God has the ability to be rational, to think, to have a will, to be a person, and mankind is given that same those same attributes. Maybe not to the same extent and all that kind of thing, but we have the ability to understand what God says. We have the ability to speak to God. We have the ability to reason. We have the ability to have a will, and that's actually interesting too, because when God calls man to be who he is, we have the opportunity to refuse that. We have the opportunity to deny that. We have the opportunity to walk away from that. And so while everything else, and really it's fascinating to look at the animals, and the Bible clearly talks about the animals. Look to the ant, O sluggard. It calls out different attributes of animals and praises these things as good and reflective of who God is. The animals don't refuse that. You don't
have a choice. Yeah,
they don't have a choice. You don't find ants, up in little hammocks and taking it easy, and you don't see that. But with mankind now, all of a sudden we have a choice, and this becomes kind of fundamental for this idea of relating to God. We have the choice of how we're going to relate to God. And obviously, when we get to chapter 3, that choice will have some pretty profound consequences. So we have this idea of just mankind being able to relate to God, to hear God's voice, to understand God, and some of the attributes that he needs in order to do that. But we also have a call to work, and that's also interesting. So when you were growing up, did you see work as a really important manifestation of your faith?
No. Work was a means to an end and completely separate from my faith.
Yeah. I would say that that's how I looked at it as well. That, I had a job at JB's formerly big boy, and had that job, really the way that I carried out my job wasn't. I didn't see a very strong connection between. I mean, obviously, I shouldn't steal from them and things like that. But I didn't understand the importance of that to my Christian faith. Now, what is the significance to you now of the fact that man is called to work?
That's a great question. It's funny because I derive great meaning and purpose from my work. And I think millennials kind of have this idea that they, want to have this meaning and purpose to work and not have it simply be a means to an end. And maybe that's got some theological significance that I didn't realize. But I think, people talk about retirement, and I'm just like, I can't envision that. I can't, envision that work is pretty integral to who I am. But as far as like a theological significance, I don't know that I have a great answer.
Yeah, but I think that you're kind of on the right track there, because I think that, as you bring up, one of the fascinating things about a lot of millennials is that they don't want to just do work for a paycheck. They want to change the world. They want to transform the world. And I think that there is a theological significance to that desire, because really what God is doing here by giving man the task of work is he's allowing man to do another thing in the image of God, which is to use his rationality, to use his mind, in order to form and organize the world to make it fruitful and a blessing. Really, that's what God is doing in creation. But the interesting thing is God doesn't complete it. God doesn't put it in its best possible situation. He leaves man to finish that work, which means that man has this high calling of being able to be like God, to be able to put things in a better place, to be able to organize them, to be more productive, to be more fruitful, to be a greater blessing. And I think that what you see is young people striving for that meaning and that purpose of work that's largely been lost, because for so long we worked for a paycheck. Even a lot of us as Christians worked for a paycheck. There's a much greater purpose to work, and one of the fascinating things is that, and I'm sure you've experienced this in the work that you do, in trying to put the world in a better place, it doesn't cooperate. And so I've talked about in sermons a lot, just trying to do projects around the house or here at the church or whatever. You're in a situation where you're training people to move on and to be doctors and nurses, and the nice thing is that medicine's got everything sorted out, right? Everything's already taken care of, all the problems are already solved. No, what we find is that the world is so much more complex than we thought it was. But in trying to solve those problems, we discover the rationality, we discover the organization, we discover really the glory and the greatness of who God is.
So if I'm, let's say, I'm working as a custodian or something, and I view it purely as a paycheck, and I hate my job, and how could this transform that situation?
Well, I think that's an interesting thing. One of the things that we'll get into later on is the difference between kingship and priesthood. And if you're in a job that maybe doesn't really challenge you that much, as far as intellectually or something like that, you're not. If you're say a custodian, it's not like you're constantly, your mind is just grappling with these subatomic particles or anything like that. I mean, it's a fairly routine job. You're kind of in the role of priesthood, where your job is to see the glory in maintaining an order that's already understood, right? It's the same thing when we clean up our house or clean up our room. It's not like that's a mental challenge for us. And so where's the glory in it? Well, the glory is in understanding and reveling in the order that's already understood, to see the goodness of creating something that, or participating in something that, while not difficult, is greatly beneficial to the people around.
Having a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old at home, I don't know that I would describe my house as an order that is understood.
Well, you understand how to do it. You just don't understand where you're going to get the time to do it. So, but yeah, and they don't understand that yet. To them, it is kind of a challenge, right? You help them with that challenge. You say, well, we're gonna put the cars with the cars and the blocks with the blocks, and you know what I'm saying? Like they don't. If you tell a kid that's young enough to go clean their room, they don't have any idea what you're talking about. You actually have to walk them through that.
Oh yeah, Uriah decided that everything just went on his bed, and then he pulled the covers over it. He's like, my room's clean.
Yeah. But as you get older, you still have to engage in those things, and there's an element where you can say, I'm bored of this. But there's a great glory in, God has the sun come up every day, and God sends the rain. God does a lot of repetitive things. And C.S. Lewis, I think it was, who talked about us being older than God because we're tired of this. But he says, this once again, this is a glorious thing, and he celebrates those things. And I think there's a calling in that of if you're working one of those jobs that's you have the routine down. Can you still glory in the goodness? It was good the first time you did it. Is it not good the second time, the third time, the fourth time? And so that work, that calling to work, is important. So there's other things here that God is doing, and one of them is calling man to name the animals. Now, again, probably most of the time when we are young, we look at this and we don't understand the significance or importance of it. But from a scientific point of view, what's significant to you about naming the animals?
In the Bible, names have a meaning, and it's kind of more like Native American names, runs like a deer or something like this has a meaning built into the name, and that is the name, and so it kind of encompasses what that object is and defines it to a certain extent. You might look at some of the Latin names that are given to insects and things of this sort, and they're rich in meaning.
Right. And that's really an important thing. And again, when I first read this, I was like, okay, so Adam names the animals, but there's something really powerful that's going on here. And in naming the animals, what Adam's doing is he's looking at the order that God created. He's perceiving a structure and a value system and a complexity, a pattern to creation. He's understanding what God has done with those things, and then he is putting a word to that. So God creates starting with a word, and man looks at what God has created and then puts a word to it. If we're going to talk about having a relationship with God, how are we going to do that? How are you going to relate to somebody? As you have two sons, and how do your sons relate to you? They watch you and they see the patterns of what you do, and then they start putting words to those patterns. Right? They start understanding it and being able to label it, to grab a hold of it, to have some kind of power in understanding, and then they can start to interact with you based on that. Now, the last thing that happens here is that a helper is needed for Adam, and a helper is not found in the animal world. So God takes and creates woman and then has them live in covenant with one another. You see, God is a God who exists in community. That's the whole idea of the Trinity, is that God is in community. There's a relational nature to who he is. And man has to be, being made in the image of God, man has to live in community as well. It's one of the things that's important about the small groups that we're doing here, and the whole idea of believing, belonging, and becoming. The belong part of what we do is really important because God has made us to live in community. When you live outside of community long enough, you start to not understand who you are, who God's made you to be, and the calling that he's given you. And so it's important to live in community. It's vital to live in community. And I think that's where we'll wrap up section 2. So we have one more section if you guys have time to do it. If not, maybe watch it throughout the week. We're going to be talking about culture and worship.